Hi, I'm Nathan Cole of natesviolin.com, and today let's talk about purity practice, how to find your phrase by losing your vibrato, hopefully not permanently. Let's take a look at the opening of the Barber Violin Concerto. It's a nice romantic phrase with usually lots of vibrato. And it goes on, but we'll confine ourselves to that bit for now. Now, phrases over time, if you're not listening carefully, can tend to get boring. They tend to flatten out. The sound gets more similar through the phrase. The vibrato might get a little stagnant. It might start to sound more like this. Etc. And that's not terrible, but it's pretty boring, I think you would agree. So what's happening? Why does it go from interesting to boring? Well, violin is difficult. There's a lot going on, and it's easy to lose track of the bigger picture. If you think about the music on the page, the notes, and compare them to language, the notes might be like letters, and a group of notes like something like that might be a word. And then, of course, if you want to speak a sentence and be understood, that's a phrase, and that's what you want to be able to convey all throughout your playing. So a phrase starts with a plan. You got to have a plan, and I like to say, well, not just me, I think Perlman was the first one I heard say it. If you can't hear it in your head, you can't play it. And a lot of people don't like, they just kind of cringe when you say, oh, I'm going to plan out this phrase. They don't like that because they're afraid it's not going to sound natural. Well, if your phrases already sound great and natural, then you don't need a plan. And once you get comfortable making phrases that make sense to listeners, then you don't need to plan every one in advance. But if you're here, that means that you're looking for some guidance on how to more effortlessly find the phrase. So that's going to be a plan. Basically, a plan is about volume, how much sound you're making at different parts of the phrase. Sound quality comes into it too, but basically it's about how loud each of the notes is and how you connect them. So, a few questions to ask if you're looking at the music. What's the most important note in the phrase that I'm trying to make? What are some of the smaller shapes within the phrase, groups of notes, again like that, or little groups like that. And then third, how am I going to connect those small moments that I've already marked in, the most important note, the miniature shapes, how am I going to connect those together for an overall shape? Now, if we're talking volume, you already know that the left hand can't make the sound louder and softer, right? So this is going to be a right hand thing. And I bet you already know the three variables that go into making sound with the bow. Bow speed, bow pressure, and then contact point, how close to or far from the bridge you are. So speed, pressure, and contact point. So if you know those things, then in theory, it should be easy to make a great phrase, right? You drop your plan on the music, and then you use your knowledge of the three variables to make it louder and softer when you want to. What happens is we get distracted, right? And vibrato is one of, if not the number one distraction. I've already made a video that you can see on YouTube of effortless and flexible violin vibrato, and that will help you shape a vibrato without tension, which is important if you're going to tackle phrasing, because tension in the vibrato not only makes it sound less interesting, but it also tends to work its way into the right hand as well. There's that connection between the two hands. They often want to do the same thing. Along those lines, I made another video called Finding Your MVP, or Minimum Viable Pressure, finger pressure. That also is about breaking that automatic connection between the two hands, automatically pressing harder with the left hand when we want more sound in the right. So those are two good videos, the vibrato video and the MVP video, to check out to kind of pave the way for phrasing. But even then, let's say that you're making a nice effortless vibrato, you're not pressing too hard in the left hand. The vibrato can still be a distraction because some mental energy goes to the left hand and it comes out of the right hand. So my solution for purity practice is to get rid of the vibrato entirely, and that's going to reveal exactly what your right hand is doing. So again, if I sort of took my boring version of the barber, etc., if I take out the vibrato and really see what my right hand is doing there, it might sound like this. Many people find it hard to completely get rid of vibrato, but make yourself do it. Listen for the right hand. Noticing that I've got mostly one bow speed, one bow pressure. That really sounds boring without the vibrato. So, how does that compare with the plan that I should have drawn up on paper? Probably not very well. So let's take a look at my plan. So here is the first phrase of the barber, and I've taken the liberty, sorry, Mr. Barber, of doctoring up the part a little bit here to put in a little plan. Now this is going to look very detailed, but it's just an example of something I might do in practice, and I do it in pencil, of course, because pencils have erasers and I can always change my mind. But I'm going to ask myself those three questions that I laid out for you. What's the most important note? And we went up to right here in the phrase. Usually you can identify the most important note either by dynamics that are already given to you. In this case, we've just got a starting dynamic of mezzo forte and a little shape here that goes down eventually to piano. And by looking at the contour of the line. Often the most important note is the highest one. In this particular phrase, this B is the highest note, but of course that's not going to be the loudest one because we've been explicitly instructed by the composer to dim to piano there. So I've chosen this A that comes right before it. That's going to be what I'm aiming for in that whole first phrase. And so I've marked it forte. You could say fortissimo if you wanted, but that's what we're going to be aiming for. The second question was little shapes. What are the shapes of notes or groups of notes in there? So I've taken a lot of the long notes like this first one, and even this one I forgot to mark a little dim on there. I've put dims on those because often vibrato and bow get stuck because we try to sustain long notes to the bitter end, and that's usually going to sound unnatural. Sometimes you do want to. I'm going to mention one of those exceptions, but often you want to let these notes breathe or develop or just diminuendo. And as long as you're connecting the rest of the phrase, that's going to sound just fine. This group of four notes here, I see as a crescendo to the next beat. Same with this one, same with this one. So I've gone ahead and marked in little crescendos there. I've put in, yep, that's all my little shapes. And now finally the third question, how am I going to connect all of those together? And that's why I've written in some dynamics there. By the end of this bar, it'll be something like piano. This long note might start mezzo piano. This one's a little higher, so it might start mezzo forte and taper. Here, this quarter note that's tied over, that might be one that I don't want to diminuendo because it's in the middle of this longer shape. So that one I'm going to allow to keep crescendoing. This one, however, I'm going to let it come down a little bit to make room for the big daddy, the most important note in the phrase. So I've answered my three questions, got a plan. Let's see how that plan's going to sound. So I'm going to play what I've planned out with no vibrato, and see now if I can replicate what I've got on the page. Boy, my bow arm feels a lot freer doing that, and I notice that I've got to change the speeds quite a lot more than I was for the boring version. I also notice I'm not trying to sustain quite as much. One other thing I notice, and I hope you will too, you will start to feel the resonance of the instrument or the ring as long as you're playing dead in tune. So this very first note should be quite a ringing one on the violin, this D. In fact, if it's really in tune, I'll even see the open D string vibrating a little bit. That E should be another ringing note, and so forth. So if you are really in tune, you'll hear that, you may even feel it, and that's what you'd like to go for, because you want to keep that even when you add the vibrato. Now, in my practice, I would repeat this phrase without vibrato until those motions felt natural. Until I felt like I was getting what I had planned on the page. If I felt like my phrasing plan sounded unnatural for some reason, I'd adjust it. But once it felt natural, then, and by the way, I'm paying special attention to the bow changes because I don't want to hear things like, right? That's not at all what's on the page. Once that does feel natural, then I'm going to add just enough vibrato that I can still feel that ring or that resonance. So instead of, it would be a very gentle vibrato. And I would continue in that way. It's just enough, and I still want to hear and feel that ring. And so forth, and now I feel that phrase coming alive. I'm going to insist that my bow arm feel exactly the same as it did when I played without vibrato, and that can be tough, especially if you haven't tried this kind of practice before. For some folks, as soon as you start adding back that vibrato, the bow arm wants to go back to the one speed, one pressure thing. If that happens to you, take away the vibrato again, just lose it, and go back to the purity, and eventually you'll get used to that feeling of the bow arm leading the sound. You can alternate back and forth, little vib, no vib, until you're able to do them both with equal ease. So, to summarize these steps for the purity practice, you start with your plan. It's important to write it down in pencil, put it on the page. Start with your most important note, then the miniature shapes, and then how you're going to connect those, and you can name some dynamics on there if you want. Play your plan with no vibrato, and then compare what you're hearing to what you see on the page. Adjust your bow, the 3 variables. Pay special attention to the bow changes. And if you're having trouble with some of those bow changes, just make sure that the speed and the pressure match on either side of the bow change. Doing a bow change at the tip, make sure that the speed and pressure is the same at the end of the down bow as at the beginning of the up bow. Find you're listening for the ring and the resonance, adjusting your pitch if you're not getting it. And then finally adding just enough vibrato that you can still hear and feel that ring while keeping your bow arm exactly the same as it was with no vib. And you can alternate between those 2, vib and no vib, to get that feeling ironed in. So, to learn more tips and tricks, visit natesviolin.com. I'd love to see you there. I want you to pick up my free practice guide if you haven't already. And I will see you here next time. Let's close with a different part of the Barber Concerto.